Here we go.
Okay. Well, hi, my name is Mick Smyer, and along with Kim Mitchell, we're pleased to present a growing, emerging collaboration that we're calling Growing Greener Communities. And what we'd like to do in our session this morning is tell you a little bit about the context, why we're concerned about sustainability issues, how we're using some techniques and approaches developed in the Growing Greener organization that I had, and how we're linking that to strategic doing to move not only individuals from anxiety to action, but communities and organizations from anxiety to action on the climate crisis. So we're going to tell you some stories and share some background on what we've been doing. Kim and I have put our contact info in the chat, and we will be glad to respond to questions and comments as we go. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. It's not going to be death by PowerPoint, I promise. But I want to start off by asking a couple of questions and ask you to respond in the chat. And the first question has to do with what percentage of the US population is worried about global warming? So just type in the chat what you think the answer is to that question. What percentage of the US population worries about global warming? And then Kim, if you can read out any numbers that emerge there, that'd be helpful.
All right.
So what percentage of folks worry about global warming in the United States?
All right. We've got several answers. 45%, 33%, 40%, and another 40%.
Okay. Well, the data that I'm going to show you, 62% is the answer that comes from the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, one of the premier public opinion polling groups on climate issues. So about almost 2/3 of the United States say, I'm worried about global warming. And 72% say, yeah, it's really happening. But how about this? What percentage of Americans talk with their family members and friends, often or frequently, about global warming or climate change? What percentage of us talk with our family members and friends? Again, if you just type in what your estimate is in the chat, that'd be great. So we get a feel for what we think our fellow citizens are doing about talking about the problem. We know 62% are worried about it. 72% acknowledge it. What percentage of us talk with family members and friends about it? And again, Kim, if you could just read out some of the numbers there.
Yeah, we've got a wide range here, 25%, 10%, 90%, and 25%.
I'd say we got it bracketed. The over and under is pretty clear. The data from Yale suggests 35% of us talk with family members or friends about this. So we have what I call a climate silence or a climate avoidance habit. Maybe you feel like John. John's a farmer from Montana. He knows climate change is happening because he has seen the impact on his crops and his production. He's worried. In fact, what John says is not a lot of people, myself included, know what they can do that's going to make a significant difference in the near future. So it's no wonder we don't talk about it, because we feel like we're powerless. And if you think you're powerless, what about John? John, it turns out, is a US Senator from Montana, John Tester. And this is a quote from an interview he did with NPR this week, recently, on some of the legislation under review right now in the Congress having to do with sustainability issues. So that's the problem. We have a climate avoidance or a climate silence habit. And what we've been doing at Growing Greener is trying to figure out how to break that habit and move people from anxiety to action on climate issues. Now, I start from an assumption that we're each on a climate journey, and we feel better when we know where we are on our journey and what the next step is. For example, my journey started in 2005. Why 2005? Well, I was born and raised in New Orleans. I know I don't sound like it. I didn't eat the oysters, but I was born and raised in New Orleans, and we all know what happened in 2005 to New Orleans, Hurricane Katrina. And although I wasn't living there at the time, it was a real gut punch to watch my hometown flood and the devastation that followed afterwards. Now, if you ever think about my home state of Louisiana, maybe this is your image. But in fact, this is the reality where the wetlands have been depleted through a combination of natural and human causes. So now New Orleans and Southeast Louisiana is much more vulnerable to extreme weather and the storms that come ashore. So 2005, I really started to pay attention to extreme weather and climate change. And then my own climate journey accelerated about 5 years ago with the birth of these guys, Gus and Bailey, and they're flanking their 2-year-old brother, Rowan. And of course, I can't forget their cousin, Teddy, the best looking grandkids in the world. Now, what do these goofballs have to do with climate change? Well, obviously, they're a proxy for future generations. And now it's easy for me to picture the world that I am leaving them and what the world will be like in 60, 65 short years when they're my age. And that's one of the motivators for me. But enough about me. Let's talk about you. What I want you to do now, I'm going to ask you 4 simple questions, and I'm going to ask you to just write down your answers. The first is picture a place, any place in the world that has special meaning to you, that you have an attachment to. And if we were doing this in person and in a workshop that we run, I'd ask you to write and sketch your answer. For example, when I answer this question, I write down NOLA for New Orleans, Louisiana, and I sketch a hurricane symbol. I also lower the artistic bar by showing my sketch. So picture a place, any place in the world that has special meaning to you. And next, picture that place affected by extreme weather or climate change. For example, when I think about New Orleans, I think about floods, and I sketch out a flooded home. So picture your place affected by extreme weather or climate change, and what is the threat that you picture? Third question is, picture that place, not how you think it'll look, but what you'd like it to look, your aspiration in 40 to 50 years from now. What do you want that place to look like in 40 to 50 years? What do you hope it will look like, your special place? And the fourth and last request is, picture something you can do now to work towards that vision that you have 40 to 50 years from now. Picture something you can do now to work towards that vision that you have 40 to 50 years from now. I'm going to stop for a moment and just ask, tell me let's hear about some of the places people have been picturing. What's a special place you had in mind? Yeah.
I'll go.
Thanks, Renee.
Good day. This is Renee B. Wallace in Detroit. So the place I picture is Detroit, Michigan.
Yep.
Yeah, we're being affected by
already
weather.
Yeah, already being affected.
Yeah.
Anybody else? So we got Detroit. Anybody else? Yeah.
I pictured a place called Waldo Lake. It's one of the clearest, cleanest lakes really in the world. It's up in the Cascades.
Okay.
And it about 20 years ago already had a wildfire that impacted its north shore.
Right.
But the concern is that more parts of the lake would not only be impacted by fire, number one, but increasing population impacts.
Right.
Add nutrients to the lake and degrade the water quality.
Right. So I could have guessed maybe Detroit because Renee and we talked a little bit before the session started. I knew she was from Detroit, but let's see if there's anybody else who wants to talk about their place. One more nominee if we have any.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, Dan, go ahead.
Oh, that's fine. My place is the North Valley of Albuquerque, New Mexico, along the Rio Grande River. It's beautiful with cottonwood trees and grasses and fields that have geese and ducks, and it's very pastoral and lovely. And so New Mexico is in the height of a drought, and if that continues, the water dries up and the river dries up and all that goes away. So.
Okay, so we got the Cascades, we got Detroit, we got the Rio Grande. John, you want to add one?
Yeah, so I'm also very mountain, but I had 2 places. I'm a dive instructor as well. So for me, 2 things stand out. There's similar problems. which would be the coral reefs off of the Florida Keys, as well as the Great Barrier Reef. I've dove both of them.
Yeah.
And so the ability to maintain those.
Right. So just look in our group, we've gone from the Great Barrier Reef to Detroit to Albuquerque. And I've done this with thousands of people all over the States and in 4 international countries. Everybody has a place they care about. Everybody, regardless of political stripe. And everybody knows the threat to it. And how about that third question when I asked you what you'd like it to look like in 40 to 50 years? How many folks said what it looks like now or what it used to look like 10, 20, 30 years ago? Anybody? I'm seeing lots of nods. I used to say that the older the audience, the more we're likely to hear 10, 20, 30 years ago because we're living climate memory. But I can't say that anymore because recently I've had college students say to me, I'd like it to look like it looked 10 years ago, which for me was chilling. It said that these young adults, even in their relatively short lives, have seen the impact of extreme weather and climate change. But how about when you get to that fourth question, what can you do about it? When I've done this with other groups, somewhere between 50 to 80% of people are stumped by that. Now, as a psychologist, if I've just left 50 to 80% of people anxious and depressed, that is great for business, but not great for climate action. And that's why we've developed a set of approaches that I'm going to show you now. But what I've just taken you through is a set of engagement activities to really get people talking about climate change. Because Catherine Hayhoe, a climate scientist at Texas Tech, says, if you're going to do one thing, talk with family members about climate change and taking care of the earth. What she's saying is leverage your networks, leverage your circles of influence, right? But the question is, how do we do that? How do we begin that conversation? Well, the National Academies of Sciences said, if you want to talk to kids about climate change, keep it social, short, and positive. Kind of like me, social, short, and positive. Social by focusing on people or places you care about. Short by focusing on a time frame that is human scaled, not 10,000 years from now, but 40 to 50 years, for example. And positive, make sure you focus on what we can do about the problem. As John Tester said, most of us feel like there's nothing we can do in the short term. And if you'll notice, the 4 questions that I just gave you embody those principles, those design principles of keeping it social. We focus on a place you care about. Short, 40 to 50 years. And we're going to get to the positive part now. Last spring, I got an email entitled Help Me. It was from a friend of mine, Emily, who works in an energy outreach organization in Louisiana. And because I'm from New Orleans, I always respond to folks from Louisiana. Emily had a very simple question. How do I reach out to brownies? I got 2 brownie troops coming together to get their sustainability merit badge. What do I do? Can I use your materials? Now, Emily reached out to me because she knew we had developed a set of climate cards called Your Climate Journey. I'm going to show you the kids version, but we also have versions for middle and high school students, for college students, and for grown-ups. Your Climate Journey really gives people, in the kids' case, 25 climate actions. But first, we ask them to picture a place. Sound familiar? And when we ask them to do that, they're very eager to sketch and draw. This is a rainforest that one of the students pictured. But we end the exercise by asking them to picture one thing they can do. That's the positive part. One thing they can do to make the world more sustainable. For example, this little boy said he was going to hang his clothes outside instead of using a dryer. So what do we have people do? Well, we have people take climate action cards. In the kids version, 25, and the grown-up versions is about 30 or so climate actions, and sort them into 3 piles. Things I already do, things I could do, and things I either cannot or will not do. By the way, these cards were illustrated by a children's illustrator for us, and she's done a great job. Kids really love these cards. So examples of the cards and actions are talking with family members and friends about climate change, turning out the lights when you leave the room, taking a nature walk, etc. When after the session, I sent Emily some cards. She used them with the brownie troop pictured here. And she sent me an email. She said, the session went great. The cards were a huge hit. But there was only one problem. I had sent Emily 20 decks to reuse in her outreach work. 17 of those decks went home with the girls because they didn't want to give them up, which from my perspective is another metric of success. That means they're going to show them to their parents, to their family members. They're going to be leveraging their networks. And what Emily said was the process of using them made the kids excited about sharing it with their family members. Now, since the pandemic, we also have online versions of all these materials. We have a click and drag exercise where you can sort the cards into the 3 piles using your mouse to just click and drag. So that's what Growing Greener has done. We've developed a set of engagement materials. And last spring, well, maybe in February or so, I was on a Facebook page for my Yale class, and I saw this picture. And I said, what is Yo-Yo Ma doing in our class Facebook page? He did not graduate with us. I would have remembered him. And who's this other guy with him anyway? So that got me interested. And Ed Morrison, whom you all probably know, is pictured here with Yo-Yo Ma. Why? Because Yo-Yo Ma had written a wonderful introduction to Ed's book and singing the praises of strategic doing. That got me interested. And I reached out to Ed and said, you know, this strategic doing stuff, dealing with wicked problems and fuzzy boundary problems, you know, climate change is that kind of problem. Have you ever really concentrated on climate change and using strategic doing to address climate change? And Ed said, no, but we'd love to do it. And thus began the collaboration that we're calling Growing Greener Communities. And what we'd like to do over the next few minutes is tell you a little bit about that collaboration. It's in the early stages, and we'll tell you a little bit about one specific example. We decided we would do 3 pilots, and so far we've developed 3 pathways, 3 pilot examples, one working with a local government, one working with a campus focused on their first-year students and using their sophomore students, second-year students to reach out to first-year students and develop a climate action plan for the campus. And the third focusing on schools, particularly an elementary school. And it's that third example that you're going to hear more about in the next few minutes. But together we're asking a very simple question. How might we grow greener schools and greener communities together? Greener schools, in this case, is the focus with some work we're doing in Shreveport. And now Kim is going to tell you more about that Growing Greener Schools effort, which is really a collaboration between and among Growing Greener, Strategic Doing, and Community Renewal in Shreveport. So Kim, let me turn it over to you. And I guess we could also say if there are questions at this point. I realize I went through that pretty quickly, but my goal was about 30 minutes. And I think I brought it in a little bit under time. So we have time for questions and comments. If not, I've left larger groups. So
Mick, let me just jump in here and ask the strategic doing practitioners. I mean, one of the things that I saw when Growing Greener, when Mick presented Growing Greener to me are underlying principles of Growing Greener and underlying principles of strategic doing and the alignment. And so I'd like you to reflect on that at some point, because I'm not a psychologist, Mick is. And there's a lot we can learn from Mick and how he thinks about change. How do we move our change? And so I'd be interested in carrying on that conversation. So I just wanted to alert people.
Well, maybe I can just say one thing, Ed, and then I'll turn it over to Kim, because that's a really good question. As you know, Ed, one of the premises of the work we've been doing in Growing Greener is the psychology of small wins. Starting with small wins that lead to bigger steps and bigger wins. Let me give you one quick example. We did a workshop with a church up in outside of Boston in Swampscott. had 30 or 40 parishioners come together. They started making individual goals, and the guy who headed it up, Gordon Angel, that's his real name. Gordon was kind of depressed and said, yeah, we're each doing our individual actions, but I don't know that we're getting anywhere. But what he didn't realize was the power of bringing 30 or 40 people together, realizing I'm not the only one who's worried about this. We haven't been talking about it because we're just like those data we showed you at the beginning. But within a year and a half, they had solar panels installed on the roof of their church, which did three things: cut down their carbon impact, cut down their expenses, but most importantly, perhaps, gave a message to that New England community about what stewardship looked like in an era of climate crisis. And the solar installer said, this went extremely quickly. Why? And Gordon said, well, we had this little workshop that started out focusing on individual steps. And that got people thinking about and opened them up to asking questions that you all do in strategic doing all the time. How might we, or what would it look like if we did X? And that led to the solar panels. And the installer said, well, boy, that was just amazing. But it started with the psychology of small wins.
See, I think we in practicing strategic doing need to become more adept at explaining the psychology of small wins. I encountered that here in Ecuador. Just because we were starting out, okay, we're going to transform the Ecuadorian economy, and one of the pushbacks we got, well, we're just doing these really small steps.
Right.
I mean, how would we do that? And so I made a note to myself that I did not explain that very well, and that's one of the things that I think we all are going to confront is how do we move to collective action, and how do we explain that small steps really matter?
Especially on something as big as climate change and the climate crisis. Renee?
Yeah, that's really, really important because the everyday person already feels like it's so big that there's nothing they can do. Right. I happen to be involved in Detroit's work on the climate strategy, and the team I'm on is specifically working with citizens. So the municipality is doing what it's doing. We're in planning stage, right?
Right.
And when you talk to everyday people, you really do have to bring it down to, I love your action cards. I need a set yesterday. What you already are doing, what you could do. And one of the questions that I most appreciate in that deck is what you cannot or won't do.
Right.
Well, in places like Detroit, where and other cities like Detroit, where you may have people with limited resources,
right?
There are some things that you can do, and there are some things that you can't do, and also in places where people are making choices about what they won't do. Right. So I really, most times people don't want to lift that part up. It's kind of like left unsaid, but I think there's great value in having the answer to that question in the room.
Well, that's a good point, Renee. And when I do this work and when I train others to do the work, run the workshop, we go back through each of those piles and we do two things with each pile. With the no way pile, I call it. First thing we do is say, we're not going to nag you. We're not, if you say that's no way for whatever reason, for example, I would love to use public transportation, but I live in a small town that doesn't have public transportation. I put that in my no way pile, not because I'm opposed to public transportation. I just can't do it. It's not possible for me. So we tell people we're not going to nag you on that. But the other thing we do is we ask people to compare their no way piles and ask a simple question: is your no way pile exactly like the person next to you? And 99.9% of the time, even with spouses, best friends, partners, 99% of the time, they're different. And that makes the point that each of us is on an individualized journey. Yeah. And we have to make, and we're each making choices. Yeah. And that's really, it's empowering. It's empowering for people to hear that,
I would love to see that as can't do, won't do, because can't do and won't do are really two different questions.
Yeah.
When I'm in conversation with people in community, we're modeling the food system in Flint. So I hang out in places where folks are, right. I grew up in a town like Detroit, right? And so can't do and won't do are often two different circumstances.
Absolutely.
But this is great. Thank you for this.
But a flip side of what you're saying, Renee, is that in the workshops, there's a lot of peer education going on where somebody says, I can't do that. And their neighbor says, oh, I already do that. Like I remember talking about composting in San Francisco, and people said, I can't compost in San Francisco. And somebody else in the room said, well, I already do it. Here's how you do it. You know, so there's a lot of peer education that goes on and interaction that goes on with the materials. Well, Kim, I've now arrived at a half hour.
Okay, well, cool. Cool. Well, now I get to add my part of this story, which is really, it's fun. And I've known Ed for a long time. In fact, we came together in 1994 and have supported each other in our work since that time. And Ed actually lived in Shreveport, where I live, for some period of time. And we spent lots of time on the whiteboard exploring how to align what he's doing or was doing in economic development and what I was doing in city planning and architecture. And it was a lot of fun. It was a growing period for me. And I've walked in strategic doing since. And recently, I think my daughter is on the track of getting certified in strategic doing, and is mentioned in Ed's book as the NASA connection. And so it's strategic doing is, for me, just like our colleague Bob Brown says, it's just a way of being. And so when Ed and Mick started talking about moving individual agency to collective action, Ed invited me into the conversation and mentioned pilots. And so I had an idea that, and it has to do with the university elementary school in Shreveport, where we have used strategic doing around creating a culture in the school. And so it's a school that already has that experience of strategic doing. And what I'm going to do is give you a little background on that school and its culture, and then where that comes from, because it's really applying some principles and practices of a work that I'm involved in called Community Renewal. Give you a little background on that, and then end up with where we are in shaping this pilot for the coming year and how that's taking shape with the core team. And I'll also share some strategic doing aspects of all of it. So I'll try to be as quick as I can. I'm not necessarily noted for that, but I'm going to attempt to do it. So, so here's our first We Care school. We've got an article about it. Our writer wrote, to build the culture of caring. Well, you don't really build a culture of caring, you grow it. And there is this expression in education that students don't care what you know till they know that you care. The problem with that is that we leave teachers to do that as individuals and not together. So we're introducing for them that they need to care together. There's more power in that and more reinforcement. And in strategic doing fashion, when we started this, it actually happened with a boundary spanner in our community, and one who's associated with Community Renewal. And boundary spanners are maybe the most valuable people in your community in terms of getting people together who need to get together. And so this lady, Mary, saw that what was going on at this elementary school, that she needed to connect Community Renewal and this principle. And so we did, and we started on a process. And so our framing question for the school is, imagine we are creating pathways to a culture of caring as the foundation for learning and community. What will that look like? Now, that's may not seem like a very radical idea, but it is actually counter to education. It is it's framing a way to begin to shift the system of education to prioritize relationships over things like career, cradle to career pipelines, or even the one we don't like, which is cradle to prison pipelines that education somehow associated with. And so here's looking at it in terms of strategy and a diagram that we use in strategic doing. So we're answering the two questions of strategy. Where are we going? How are we going to get there? And, the outcomes answer the question of where we're going. And then the pathways and the initiatives, the small steps that we identify, move us toward that outcome. So with University Elementary, the outcome we seek is this foundational position for a culture of caring, foundational for learning and for community. Where we start is that we are enlisting the school community to use their imaginations and create these pathways. And that school community is the educators and staff, the students, the parents, and the school partners. And the pathfinding initiatives that have emerged through this pilot have just created an amazing shift. And just for example, when this principal started in this school, there were 750 referrals to the office in 1 year. Last year, in taking on this pilot and growing it, there were 21. That's pretty significant amount of change. And so it's been a lot of fun too, because we're using our imaginations, we're creating it, all the small steps began to add up. And just to show you, as we started this, we were looking at what might these pathways look like, but not just for the separate groups, but for, all right, these groups influence one another. This is system change. So the things that educators are doing for their pathway will influence the students. The students will also influence the parents. And so this was an important concept in getting started. And one of the principles of community renewal, which essentially all we're doing is applying principles and practices of community renewal. And one of them is we cross all lines of difference. Well, in a school, those lines of difference are grade levels. And so that became an important organizational way to look at the school. And using a house structure was a way that we could begin to do that, to put all grade levels in each of, started off as 8 houses, currently is 6. And the houses are named for characteristics of a culture of caring. And so we invented a card game of catching people caring. And there's 2 aspects of that. Who's doing the caring act is important, but even more important is the person who's taking the time to write down the caring act. And that actually becomes a leadership skill and seeing good in other people. And so that's had a tremendous cultural change, because creating culture is really nothing more than intentionally imposing practices and rituals. And you can't benefit from what you don't pay attention to or you don't see. And so often we've come numb to the caring acts that are going on all around us. So in essence, we're just calling more attention to a reality that exists that society is taking us away from. And some things that we've noticed, that teachers are overwhelmed, but we saw like 95% of the teachers were motivated and got engaged in this, that they added to their school mission. And so now caring supports communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and creativity. And we've seen this huge leap in creative energy, despite all the criteria that teachers have cast upon them. They are finding joy in experimenting with this and moving from a competitive paradigm in education to one where competition is about cooperation. And then, this idea that a game can help us cultivate relational leadership skills by seeing good in other people. There is an emerging environment of trust, which makes this community ripe for benefiting from strategic doing. And then this intentional focus on caring is releasing a new civic spirit, which is really a cool thing. And all schools in Louisiana are required to have what they called a positive behavior intervention support system, which generally is one of correcting people. Well, we got this We Care School idea accepted as the plan for university. Now, just a little background on community renewal, so you'll understand that this is actually an experiment of that what community renewal does is citywide. It connects people in their capacity to care across all lines of difference that are seen as the relational foundation. That makes a new asset. How they do that is through 3 platform strategies. One's called Renewal Team, that really aligns and mobilizes individuals and organizations of all types, including government, across the entire city and makes visible caring people. And then there's a second strategy called Haven House, which is simply block leaders making friends where they live, which is a good thing. And people do need a little bit of training because they're a little afraid to go knock on the neighbors' houses, several houses down, and get to know them. And so we enlist, equip, and encourage this network. But the cool thing is these block leaders across the city do form a network. A lot of them are boundary spanners. It was one of these block leaders that connected us to University Elementary. And the connection between wealthy neighborhoods and poor neighborhoods is really transcendent. And from a perspective of creativity, you begin to connect these different perspectives of reality across the city. And you get people to adjust their thinking, to not look at poverty as materialistic, but to look at it relationally, which becomes a great equalizer when you realize the folks living in the gated golf course neighborhood relationally may be more broken than the folks living in our most concentrated disadvantaged neighborhood. And then finally, Friendship House, which is the most intense in our concentrated disadvantaged neighborhoods. We move a staff person in. The first thing they do is connect the people that are generally living in fear and isolation because there's a lot of good people there, but they don't know who really cares. So we connect them, and that social capital grows. And that's the first step to turning the neighborhoods around where we have this intense focus from being the most dangerous places in the city to now being the safest. And then after a couple of years of being present, we build a house that has a community room and a residence for the what we call community coordinators to live and serve in Friendship. And so the why we do it is because we see relational disconnection as the fundamental cause of our societal decay. And in order to grow what we think of as an ever-renewing community, which gets better and better and better. And, that some things that hold up this theory of change come from Arnold Toynbee, who studied all of our great civilizations, and he noticed a pattern, but he also gave us a definition of society as not stuff, but a system of relationships. And then what he concluded is that all great civilizations rise only to collapse, not from external threat, but from internal dysfunction, and which led our founder, Mac McCarter, to another thinker who posed this question: why do we keep collapsing the civilizations that we construct? Can't we learn from one civilization to the next? And then what community renewal has added to that comes out of the minister who says, well, if that's true, if society is a system of relationships, then we can move in a different direction if we apply and scale the rules of positive relationships. And there are plenty of those rules, but 3 in particular, that relationships are dynamic. We're either growing closer together or farther apart, that to have a good relationship, you must be intentional. And then we must come together in the things that we share in common. If we come together in our differences, we're likely to just polarize. If we come together in what we share in common, our differences now become assets and because we're more willing to listen. And then this is just a diagram to show you how strategic doing fits into this, but I'd like you to think of community renewal as just a caring capacity connector. And willing people are attracted to this. The organization gives them some tools and encouragement and a process for growing. And then they select where they want to be involved in these three strategies. And in doing that, they form a citywide network, this new asset that we'll call the relational foundation. Well, this has characteristics of agility to more quickly respond to needs, and then to more rapidly respond to opportunities. And then because the network begins to know each other across lines of difference, it's an easier environment to form learning doing communities that really tap the creative capacities and innovative capacities of this network. So community renewal creates this foundation. The tool that we activate or are experimenting with activating is how do we apply strategic doing to this to really grow the relational capacity of community. And it's John McKnight who really frames it, that the world's telling us we live with deficits, but through relationships, we have abundance. And so this gives a little background in what we're doing and why the We Care School environment. So community renewal is continuing to develop this model that connects our capacity to care as a system, that when we do that, we get a new asset for a community that really wasn't there. And then out of this network, we're starting to see trust grow at scale, diversity become an asset, and there's this creative emergence that happens, which is really about system change. And people can find their pathway to fulfillment and purpose in community, not just as an individual. And an important element, and I hope this is not dragging on too long, we're about to get back to growing greener, but the framework that community renewals uses is a village, and it has these 7 elements in the relational foundation. And I would ask you to think of the elements as relationships, not stuff. And the current nature of our relational foundation is one of greed and envy. And it is that nature that is producing a lot of the problems of our current society. Our institutions are now siloed. We're increasingly polarized, which is creating blindness to reality. And all these negative things that have put us into what you would have to call vicious cycles. We're using linear mechanical thinking to try to fix problems in our silos and missing the value of community as a whole system. So this framework gives us a way to think about the whole, but we want to move in a different direction. Certainly, the economists did get part of it right when they said individuals make rational decisions in their own self-interest, which has really put us on this path. But they were wrong in the sense that their ideal human being, the Homo economicus, is not true. That we actually, and John Haidt gave us this, that we more often use our emotional decision-making and use rationale to justify our emotional decisions. And so we're moving to a different place where changing the nature of the relational foundation. And when we do that, we begin to benefit from seeing the whole and paying attention to the connections and flows of these elements. And it allows us to lean into complex, what I call a complex living adaptive whole system of community. And we do get to the abundance of relationships when we're looking at those connections and changing from a world of deficits to a world of abundance. And so with this background, that kind of gives you a little bit of community renewal. And I hope you can see that We Care Schools is really an experiment in using strategic doing to validate what can happen when we activate change through the work or through that network that we call a relational foundation. So that brings us to strategic doing. And Mick, and if you got any questions, about any of what I just covered, please just put it in the chat. We'll get back to it. But Mick, you may want to, and Ed, you may want to join in this part of the presentation. But when we came together, Mick, Ed, and I, the question or the framing question was, what are we going to do to take the individual agency or actions coming from Growing Greener and then move to collective actions that use strategic doing as the operating system. So we have this pilot, and we have actually begun to do that. We framed the action for the school community as imagine we are growing a greener school and community from our university elementary culture of caring. And so what does that look like? And, how do we have those conversations about the outcomes we seek, the pathways we're going to create? And we formed a core team. The principal we took through a process, and she was, she had to digest the idea, see if it would fit within her context of this culture that she's created at the school. And so she liked it. And we had meetings with her, Ed and Mick and I talked about it. That led to her forming a core team of about 20 educators and with a commitment to select fifth graders to be part of the core team. They're not actually there yet. And so we've lined up our resources to support the effort through Growing Greener, Strategic Doing, and Community Renewal. And what's happening just recently is a decision that out of this core team, we need some folks that are going to take responsibility for being the guides and coaches of Growing Greener in the school. We need some that'll serve the same role of for strategic doing. As the principal has said, I want strategic doing to be an integral part of our culture of caring at this school. And as we've engaged in conversations with this core team, we began to explore, well, what are some of the possibilities, or what are some of the areas of interest that might fit this? And we need to learn a little bit. And so some categories that have come up, and we're now in the process of kind of a library for the teachers to help guide this, but ecological footprint, local food system, what we're doing with the waste, the watershed of our community, city growth patterns, and then community resilience. And those categories give us an opportunity to help them frame outcomes for each house. And, this is a bit of a schedule, just trying to see, and this is where we are at this time. So if you look, we formed a core team. We've now got the Growing Greener Communities Through Schools collective actions that we're looking at, the individual actions for Growing Greener. We are on the verge of training these core teams. Mick will train in Growing Greener, and Ed in strategic doing, and me as a strategic doing practitioner have kind of fallen into the role of project manager, which I enjoy. But we've got 4 9-week periods in the school. And just right now, our thought is we should really spend the first 9 weeks in cultivating that individual agency and, the card game and further conversations, and let those conversations begin to help us see where the willingness is in the school and how we might really begin to frame the conversation for using strategic doing. And then through house projects, we'll go the rest of the year and see what kind of pathways and pathfinding goes on. And so this concept of we're going to get back together, the 30-30 becomes very important. It may be a different time frame at this school, but that concept of getting back together is going to be critical in the process. And then, we're using a network structure. We're going to be growing from the school into community. And, once again, the value of our boundary spanners in that network structure and how we get tight core teams. And so it'll be a lot of fun. It seems complex, but so far our educators are excited about it. And we cannot force them to do anything. It's going to be on their willingness and how they guide it. But university, as I mentioned in the plan, has structured itself around conceptual houses. And the houses reflect the diversity in the school. And so they use the names, the English is at the top, and then the name of the house is actually in the middle, and the language that represents. But just some background, university is 1,200 students from 13 neighborhoods. There are about 130 educators and staff. Each conceptual house includes all grade levels, pre-K through 5. So that's about 200 students and 21 educators and staff. And university is among the largest and most diverse elementary schools in Louisiana. And I just have to let you understand the challenge. The school is designed for 400 students. And I'll leave it to your imagination to think about the logistic issues that makes. But the framing outcome for all of these houses would be that framing statement that we mentioned. We're growing a greener school and community from our university culture of caring. But that's not all. That provides a guidance for all 6 houses. But all 6 houses include all these grade levels, which complicates things. And each house will craft its own framing question and outcome. And the decision is made by the core team that the 5th graders will be the leaders in all this. So how that works with the 5th graders essentially participating and guiding workshops at every grade level that are aimed at the big outcome and the house outcome is going to be a fun challenge to put together. And it gets back to the small steps. Each grade level should be doing a small project, something that they can build on to grow their capacity to do more complex things. But all of them are part of defining that path to their house outcome. And then, the importance of these cycles of getting back together. Do we get a project per 9 weeks, or do we get one project for the rest of the school year? That's yet to evolve from the conversations that we design. And then this cool idea that we're making 5th graders the pivot for this whole thing, and how we prepare teachers to guide them and work across the boundaries of grade levels, and then the role of the 5th graders in becoming boundary spanners for the school to community transition that we see. And it's already, just in talking about this, we've attracted an aquaponics farmer. We've attracted a high school group, seniors that are working on a project for policy change to deal with getting local food into the school cafeterias and eating healthier, and a couple of others. But so the instincts would say this can create a lot of energy if we can guide it, and strategic doing is certainly the way to do that. I want to bring it back to this concept of community as a whole system. And so in this context, we're making an intervention of growing greener communities through schools. But in system thinking, what's going to be the impact that might have on the meaningful work in this concept? Does it affect our reduce, reuse, recycle mantra of work? What might it do to our health when we, look at and learn more and take actions on the local food system and its connection? And then what are the feedbacks that we get for education? So all of these elements that we look at to help us understand community as a whole are going to be impacted through this initiative. And for us to be aware of that is something that I see particularly from our perspective. So I'm thankful to Ed and Mick for allowing this part of the experiment of growing greener, and I'm really excited about it. And with that, if there's any questions or conversations, your critique would be extremely important for us at this point, or anything. So how did I do? I left us about 15 minutes. So I guess I did 30 minutes too. So that was pretty good.
Thanks, Kim.
Sure.
Well, let's open it up for questions or comments. I have a couple of observations, but I'd like to hear, I think Kim and I talk to each other all the time. So it'd be great to get questions, comments, observations from other folks.
John's got his hand up there.
John?
Yeah. So first of all, very, very interesting. This is more about helping me. I'm new towards the strategic doing area. I'm not new to wickedness, systems, methodology, complexity, and all the other stuff that I do my research in. What I really like about this, and I'm curious about this, and then one's an observation, is you already characterized, and this is directed both towards Mick and Kim, but Kim, about your presentation, you characterize one of the characteristics of the final outcome, and that's incorrect, the dynamic final outcome, however you want to phrase that. The final thing that's always under change is the idea that it's a characteristic of learning. So what struck me as interesting is the question about learning. In other words, if we have the where are we going question, my question would be, what are we learning as we go to where we are going? And because a lot of times we aren't capturing, and it doesn't mean, we just forget how important that is, that in and of itself, back to Mick, to your point, that's the small success.
Right.
The learning in itself is enough. We didn't know this before. And the analogy I give this is, if we were looking at a learning organization, a learning institution, whatever you want to call it, a collective, you might have a threshold that the members decide upon that the learning demands refinement. The other thing may just be a threshold that says it's below that because it's not going to make that much difference in the end, but man, we should still celebrate it. So the thing is, that's a piece to it. The other part, though, is it struck me about the cards, and Mick, this came from you, is the idea of the children is, I would almost describe it as sunglasses. I start out with a clear lens, my own perspective. Hey, look what Bob's wearing over there and Sally's wearing over. They have rose-colored lenses. They have yellow lenses. I wonder what the world looks like through their lenses. I wonder if we put these two lenses together, if you remember National Treasure, where we look at red and green, and all of a sudden that was invisible, or that looked differently, becomes different. And kids get stories, kids get metaphors, and it'd be almost whatever you want to call it, hey, the Peace House compared to this house. Here, wear my glasses for a while. And what's funny is, this is borne back by research. This is de Bono 6 hats literature. This is all the other types of stuff out there. You're just taking complex concepts and bringing it down. So that was, again, just an observational thought. The other thing is, and Kim, this is just directed towards showing the idea of silos turning into the green growth plant. Mm-hmm. This is just me. What struck me is you have a great story there that you're not giving yourself credit for. And what I mean is, in between those two things is, the problem with the silo is it doesn't address connection. Yeah. And you're a systems guy. I know it just by your speech. Yeah. If you drew this as CDL, if you showed the connections, if you showed how education influenced this and this influenced that, and you said, because of this story, we have decided to evolve the model. Because I see two models, but I don't know how you quite got from one to the other. Anyway, I applaud the work you're doing. Nicely done.
Well, thank you, John. We did a workshop around that. In community renewal, something we invented to go to the educators, and there is you hit on the missing question, which is how do we get there? We're telling you where we are and where we want to be, but how do we get there? And the answer to that is we first start with creating this relational foundation. And we've got a methodology to do that. But that just leads to the challenge of, if you do not, in my perspective, if you don't use strategic doing with that network you created, you're not really cultivating the potential that you've created in connecting a relational foundation. So that's been one of, I guess, my long career and fortune to associate with Ed and community renewal has kind of led me to some ideas that we continue to develop. And Ed actually helps me with this. We call it agile community as just a concept and a practice.
John, I wanted to go back to one of the elements you highlighted, which is the learning part, because I think one of the themes that I'm seeing across the 3 pilots that we're developing is the need to meet the organization and the individuals within that organization where they are, and to integrate what we're trying to do with what they are already about. In the case of an elementary school, teachers already have a pretty clear mandate. We've told them, leave no test behind. And we have curricula to go with that. So what we've done is we've integrated our CARD activity and the Growing Greener activity so it lines up with the national standards so teachers can see that. But more importantly, we've said to them, look, when you're working with these 5th graders as leaders, they're learning leadership skills. They're also learning about the impacts. You can track it and use their math skills for, did they carry out their individual commitments? There are all sorts of pieces that behind the scenes we're integrating with what they're doing. Similarly, if I'm working with a local borough, I have to deal with their public meeting requirements, with all the opportunities and constraints that a public organization and entity has, and where they are in the climate conversation, and how much they're open to learning and doing down the road. But the learning piece is really important, both for the individuals and the organization.
Yeah,
Anyway.
Ignorance, heuristics. You're a psychologist by trade, at least my understanding.
Yeah.
Ignorance, heuristics, constraints. There's no judgment that needs to be passed on any of those. In fact, passing
Right.
judgment on them doesn't really help anybody.
Right.
But awareness.
Right.
Now,
Just
awareness.
but knowing that they're
Awareness is
there.
something else.
Yeah, exactly.
John, one of the things we've tried to introduce in strategic doing is this concept of the 30-30, which is really double loop learning. And it's, we require, well, we don't require it, but we suggest an agenda for the 30-30 meeting so that it's really, okay, what did we learn the last 30 days? What are we going to do the next 30 days? So that you're embedding this, exactly your point, which is the learning is really the value that you get out of the process, right? And so, it's not been instituted, and that's one of the reasons why we don't have too many learning organizations.
Renee, you had your hand up. Well, I think you're muted, Renee.
Yeah, so I absolutely love this. For me, it takes it right to ground level, in terms of, a 5th grader as a boundary spanner. Are you kidding me? You're talking about unleashing some folks. They get it. And when you give framework and you give responsibility, I'm super excited about that. There are a couple of things I mentioned in my introduction that I happen to be working on Detroit's climate strategy with citizens. So I really like this idea of houses, of places, and so we've been thinking about, as we come up with these ideas, how can you build these networks around certain aspects of what it is people have interest in? The flooding has been crazy here. And so who's going to do something about that? I happen to be working on implementing a citywide compost system. We can talk about it different now with all this doggone flooding, so how do you start to do that? A couple of things you talked about, I'd love to hear a little bit more about. You talked about cross all lines of difference. I love that statement. I'd really love to hear just a little bit more about the power of that, because differences, so many times people line up, with their differences. I'd like to hear more about that, as well as how you're creating these connectors of carrying capacity. You know, just being able to have that caring, and then using that frame to help build, you know, capacity and to connect that capacity, you know, across the community. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Okay. Well, it really is true. And the fact that there is this model that has 3 platform strategies, they're all doing things to deal with the whole city or specific segments, and they all work together. And that's the key. If the renewal team is where volunteers come in, and you give a volunteer that adjustment of quit thinking of poverty materialistically, think of it relationally. And so you want to participate at the block level, and you want to go help out in a concentrated disadvantaged neighborhood where we're trusted, so you'll be safe, you'll be good. And so when they cross those lines of difference, particularly in Friendship House, you know, well, just imagine the wealthy golf course person is now seeing a person living in concentrated disadvantage for who they are, meeting them where they are, and becoming friends or caring about them in a way that what I value is they now see, both of them see a greater reality. And I'm convinced in our experiments that that's the key to creative energy in a community, is get out of your like-minded groups that are only seeing truth from a very narrow lens that you are keep getting narrower and narrower, and just listen and learn. That is the key. And learning across those boundaries is a lot of fun. We've got another initiative that is extremely diverse, and it's not people that are in what I call a learning doing community. And you just follow their willingness and their energy.
Yeah, I really like that. I mean, because I think that so many times, like in this work we're doing now, we're helping people focus on the most vulnerable places and the most vulnerable people. Because if we raise the floor for in the places most vulnerable and the most vulnerable people, everybody wins. And it kind of is shaking some folks up and like, what about the rest of us? It's like, well, we're going to get to everybody, but the most vulnerable places and the most vulnerable people, you know. So when you talk about caring, that's love. I call it code for love. It's code for love, you know. And so how do you get people to move in that way to really change, you know, our community? So I really appreciate this model very much.
But, you know, we've got a colleague in Flint, Michigan, who's been at this a long time. And Ed has a strong emotional attachment because of what they've accomplished. But, you know, people that are in these challenged neighborhoods have had the hope taken out of them. And so when you're just focused on that group and trying to empower them, it's back to think about your whole city. How do we get them expand their social networks beyond, first connect the social networks where they live so they get some strength out of that, but then intentionally connect those social networks across the city so that you can get a learning community. I call it patient learning. So you get an expert like Mick or Ed, or maybe even me, and they come and engage, but can they patiently share what they know to grow the capacity of those that are live there? It's not a matter of saying, here's what I know, let me tell you what you need to do. But what is their willingness going to allow them, and how do we feed that? It's it's very great work. You know, you change your perspective from hurry up to let's start slowly to go fast. Another strategic doing principle.
Yeah, I actually do work with Bob Brown in Flint. We're modeling the food system in Flint. So that's actually where I got my strategic doing start, with Bob and Ed with the Flint, Michigan team.
I guess the one other observation I would make, even from our early work with the core team of teachers and administrators, is the power of the conversation and asking the question, what resources do we already have around the table in terms of our networks and other resources we know in the community? in our first conversation with the core team, it was amazing what the teachers were coming up with that were resources 2-3 miles away from campus. And they were excited to generate the ideas and say, oh, we could integrate this, we could do that. Just by asking the question, what if, how might we think about using the resources that we already know about? And it was a very powerful example, I think, for the teachers. Oh boy, we could actually do something pretty interesting and effective and amazing with what we already know and the resources we already know about. Well, Kim, I think we're coming close to the end of our time. Let's see if there are any other questions or comments that people want to make before we close out. Ed?
Yeah, Mick, one of the things that I'm obviously interested in is how do we develop a replicable, scalable, sustainable model for growing greener schools, growing greener communities. And so I don't think we know the answer, of course, yet, but it's something that I pose that challenge to all of our colleagues as we, Josh started in the chat, suggested something that what I thought was a great idea. And if we can start early on thinking about how do we replicate this, how do we scale it, how do we sustain it over time? These are the questions I think that we as system designers need to answer with some reasonable, not definitive answers, but reasonable hypotheses about how this could all work. And
Sure.
and I think that's really, really important as we go forward.
And Dan, I think you had your hand up too. Thanks for letting me know, Josh.
Well, this is taking me way back to my 4th grade education teacher experience and how I would have died for an opportunity like this, because I think amongst the most disempowered people in the country are our teachers. And they came that because they care about kids, they want to be creative, they want to see learning happen, and the school just beats it out of them. It's just the opposite of Agile. It's such a constrained, hierarchical, bureaucratic organization they have to function in with so many rules and restrictions. And just the engagement of teachers, giving them an opportunity to start looking at things differently and getting a community to support them is fabulous. So I'm pretty jazzed by the idea. I think it's something that can happen beautifully in any location, and we need to find a way to scale it.
Well, thanks, Dan. As the parent of a 4th grade teacher, I know exactly what you're talking about. She and I talk about it a lot, and she, in fact, helped design the kids cards and what we're doing in schools.
Yeah, and Dan, I've noticed this too, that we did the first year we did this pilot. We did we interviewed teachers and groups to find out, because teachers are so burdened. They hear about another program and they just kind of roll their eyes and say, "Oh my God, here we go again. This is going to create extra work on us." And certainly there was some of that at the beginning, but by the end of the year, they all said this was no burden at all. It's actually improved our relationship with our colleague teachers and with our students. And as you comment, I'm amazed at the burden they carry with bureaucratic curriculum, testing, central office. And so to provide them a way that they can use who they are and be creative, I've noticed it's energizing. And they're now teachers that want to get in this school. And I've learned some statistics, including 45% of all teachers tend to quit in the first 5 years of teaching. So it is hopeful, and we are getting some other schools that are moving to do this. So we're trying to get a pattern.
Yeah, I was just reflecting on professional development, which teachers have to endure, and I endured a lot of it. It had nothing to do with engaging kids. It was always about principles and practices that had to do with the hierarchy in the organization. So I think teachers are so wanting, professional development that results in real engagement, that results in tools that excite kids and get them excited as a group, and to have the community involved in all that.
Yeah.
Well, I know we're running out. We ran out of time here because folks have had to go on to their next meeting at 1 o'clock. So let me just close it by saying thank you for hanging in there and for your comments and observations. As you can tell, we're excited about growing greener communities and schools, and we hope you will be too. So thank you for today.